one thing I will say is that I do not know what I do not know. I mean, I was sitting there, you know, and trying to coordinate genetic dissemination across the Europe, Russia, and Africa region, and then suddenly COVID happened. Absolutely stops semen movement across borders, stops being able to take boars from point A to point B. COVID put a cog in the whole chain, and we worked together as a genetics industry to really make sure that we could keep that moving, keep it open. But nobody could predict what COVID was and how it would impact the business. Likewise, we've talked about global tensions, geopolitical issues in terms of Russia and Ukraine, continues to have ripple effects across the swine industry. So that's one of those things that we have to put the disclaimer in at the start. We do not know these unexpected events that can jump. But let's also put into context what I'm going to talk about today in terms of what I see as macro trends in terms of Africa. And I have the privilege of working in many different countries in Africa, and I'm going to keep this more, shall we say, Africa-centric rather than just South Africa-centric, but you're a key part of that. Disease is still going to be fundamentally important. Absolutely agree with Dr. Grimbeck this morning. You know, PRRS is something you don't want here. Go talk to Isaac about the impact of that in Spain. We need to make sure that disease control and work remains a high priority. But likewise, let's think about trends in population. We've already reached the, shall we say, peak, basically, in China, and the population is going to start coming down. The one place, really, where we're seeing this population explosion is southern, eastern, western Africa. There's a lot of people today, and there's a lot of people coming. Those people need access to affordable animal protein. So we need to make sure that we have an industry that's going to supply that, and I see that as a huge opportunity for pig production in Africa. So we need to keep our absolute laser focus on affordability and driving consumption, knowing that there are different market segments as well, that Susie talked about this morning. So why am I here? As I said before, I'm going to be looking towards the future. The one thing I'm also going to say is that there's a bit of a 10-year rule. When I was a PhD student, there were certain technologies that weren't even in existence. So things are moving that fast. So we're probably 10 years from now going to be talking about implementation of technologies that don't even exist yet. And I'm going to walk a little bit through that. We also need to focus on what we can change, what we can influence, and then understand where are the risks and opportunities. And the biggest thing is I'm going to talk a bit about genetics, because that just gets me excited. I'm a bit of a nerd for the creation of genetic improvement. Now, you guys probably in South Africa have always associated me with the Pig Improvement Company and PIC. That's not why I'm here today. I have the humble privilege of representing an organization called FAB, which is the European Forum for Farm Animal Breeders. The AB, absolutely, Jan. So there is something that we can call pre-competitive cooperation. I think that's something that the South African industry does well, but we can do better. We do it as breeding companies. So as FAB, what we've done is we brought together all of the breeding companies, multi-species, and you can see a lot of names up there. Let's just talk about pigs because we're in the room. Members include PIC, members include Dambred, members include Topigs Norsvin, Hypor, Anas, Genesis. We've come together for one voice in Europe, when we're in Brussels, when we're in Westminster, to say, this is what animal breeding is, this is what it means. And I think that solidarity is important, because there's a lot of misunderstanding of what genetic improvement is and what genetic improvement isn't. And it's that one time where we can come together collective and work together for a collective good. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is hugely important, not just in the context of Europe, but for you. So skip to the end, and I do reserve the right to get smarter. 10 years, there's basically 5 buckets. And these are all going to overlap, so I'm going to seem a little bit scatterbrained over the next 10 to 15 minutes in terms of my conversation. But I see these big buckets as data, and we're part of a data revolution. And it's going to change breeding. We're going to be paradigm shifting. It's not just a matter of the implementation of genomics anymore and how that's changed the industry. We're on the precipice of the next agricultural revolution. I'm going to talk about dissemination. Absolutely critical. Just because we do something today doesn't mean that we're going to be doing it tomorrow. I'm going to talk about gene editing. You guys have heard me talk a little bit about that before, perhaps in the past. This is starting to really gain some momentum, and it's going to change all of agriculture, not just the pig sector. And then I'm going to talk a bit about consumers and geopolitics, and wrap all of that in that big bucket item, sustainability. Now, I don't like sustainability just in the context of the planet and the environment. I also talk about economic sustainability also. But sustainability is fundamentally important as we move into the next era. But the devil's in the details, so let's dive right in. Data is huge. We're adding more traits and collecting more data to drive genetic improvement than ever before. We've always measured things like lean, growth rate, mortality. Those things are important. But let's think about the era we're in now. We talked about AI this morning. We talk about the Internet of Things and the sensors collecting all information that we don't even know that's important. Maybe what you logged into Facebook in the morning influences your pre-weaning mortality. I have no idea. But why not? We will be able to make correlations we don't even understand, and the computer will be able to interpret that. Next generation sequencing, really enjoyed the talk this morning. That can help us define the environment that the genetics are expressing their phenotypes in a more accurate way. So maybe a certain background disease profile means pigs, this particular genotype of pigs works in a different way than the other ones. I'm going to talk a little bit more about behavior, but we need to talk about where things are going. We talk about metabolomic data. That's hugely exciting. And I think much more near term than perhaps understanding the role of the microbiome in the pig and how that interacts with the host genetics. I think that's much more complex, and honestly, I think that's towards the end of our 10-year time horizon just because of the underlying complexity. But it's not just about all the data we capture in the nucleus farms, and not just in those nucleus farms that are overseas. I think the nucleus and the multiplier farms here are going to become ever more important, and capturing the data here is going to become ever more important, but also about capturing data in crossbred situations. Pure lines are not the animals that you're raising in your farm. You raise crossbred pigs, and those pigs have to perform in your environment, not in perfect environments. Capturing crossbred data on large scale really helps us to disentangle that genotype by environment interaction. And we're about to go into that step change, that next level of how we can capture data, utilize that in breeding programs to really make ongoing and robust genetic improvement into the future. But it's not just about the future. It's here, shared from one of our FAB members. We have moved from leg scoring in pigs, how it's defined by a person, to actually utilizing the camera images that are analyzing the data, and that data is then analyzed using artificial intelligence, the data that's collected in the crossbred situation. It has tripled the heritability of that trait, which means we can go 3 times faster. That is not something that's in development. That is in the indexes of animals today. Future is here. That's going to lead to more robust animals, more pigs per lifetime, lower whole herd feed conversions. That drives the sustainability piece because we're going to be doing more with less. Technology is changing not only the traits that we want to measure, but even the traits that we're measuring today. But what I get excited about is also, what are we going to do with traits into the future? We talk about animal behavior, and that can be as subjective as all you get up. I mean, I can turn around and say one pig's aggressive. Somebody else might just say, well, it's inquisitive. Very subjective. But through technology, which allows us to track individual animals and not only look at their interactions with humans, but look at their interactions with self, we're starting to understand that the way pigs interact in a pen is an actual heritable trait. So we might be able to select those pigs that more preferably interact with each other, which can lead to ongoing improvements in terms of not only dealing with negative behaviors, but also in terms of driving efficiency. That's hugely important. And the genetics of behavior is something we're only starting to understand. Massively complex, but through the use of technology to measure that trait and then unpack that with new statistical methodologies to analyze it, the future to create true pigs that are easy as possible to manage in the context of ever more labor issues in our farms is hugely important. But then that's all well and good about creating genetic improvement, but you've got to get it here. I've worked in the South African industry for, gosh, too long, 10 years plus, and I've always said very much, I do not tolerate the best indexes, etc., being in other parts of the world and not here. I want to make sure that we're driving the best genetic improvement right here, no matter if your farm's here in South Africa, if it's in Kenya, or in the back end of Russia. Everybody deserves an equal playing field. You guys control some of that. Import more frozen semen, drive replacement rates, select the right animals bred. But it's not a static conversation. As we start to look at new breeding technologies, going back to Dr. Grimbeck's point, do we want to import live animals today? Probably not. But given faster rates of genetic improvement, we need to redo the math and see if that costs us. There is no insurance policy in the world that's free. So the one level is protection, the other one is what money are we leaving on the table. And in the context of faster genetic improvement, genetic lag drifts without optimal genetic dissemination. And we need to stay focused and constantly challenge what's going on today and reevaluate if that is the right decision today or if that's a decision we need to change into the future. Because it's not just about the pigs and the improvement. Other reproductive technologies are getting exciting. The use of embryos, embryo transplantation, that is a rapidly developing field, not necessarily in the context of just developing that because of a dissemination tool, but some things like gene editing is driving the rapid development of that field it's associated with. Also, what about if we can select, instead of the actual boar or the mature boar or the gilt, we could do the selection on genotyped embryos. We could go so much faster. So these are all of the pieces that are in play right now. Just like semen sexting, an active area. We need to be able to look and see if in the future we can drive all-female production, all-male production. Is that something we deploy in multiplication? This is a technology not here today, but I see it coming into the future. And then new breeding technologies. Gene editing is a reality. And I want to be very, very clear. Gene editing is not GMO. That is different. Classical GMO is transgenics. It's bringing in external genetics into the organism. Gene editing is simply taking advantage of a process, natural mutation that's happening every generation in your farm. That's why pigs look different. But we're targeting it. The best example in pigs is the PRRS-resistant pig. Simply by taking one domain out of one protein, the virus cannot get into the pig. It is true resistance. What does that mean for you guys? Well, if suddenly Spain, North America implement this technology and start taking PRRS out of their systems, that has dramatic effects in terms of their production output, on their cost of production. We start questioning global competitiveness. But also, PRRS is one example. What if we talk about pigs that are genetically resistant to ASF? A great talk this morning. How do we manage that? What genotypes are here? If your domestic pigs are resistant, does it matter? Just to be provocative. That could change the industry, the way that we think about things, and actually make sure that we secure, whether it's here or honestly in Europe at this point, those trade agreements and make sure that we can be able to say our domestic herd does not have this particular disease. A lot of work going on in this space. And again, everybody says, well, what about how do you sell this? How do we talk about this? Well, let's not forget, this is not just doing it because we want to make more money. We're missing the point. Pigs that are not sick have a higher degree of welfare. If they're not getting this virus disease, they're not getting secondary disease. It's the reduction of antibiotic use. If pigs are more efficient and we're doing more with less, we're actually utilizing resources more efficiently, water, feed, and therefore your carbon footprint and emissions per kilo of product goes down. This is an active conversation globally, FDA in the US, ongoing discussions in Europe. This is a field that's developing very rapidly, and I've got a challenge for you on this one at the end. But just look at this. This is crops, this is plants. We're not just talking about in this space the pig sector. This is conversation in chickens, this is conversation in cows. There's a BVD-resistant cow now. I think plants is the place where this has huge application. Drought-resistant corn, pesticide-resistant potatoes. This could revolutionize agriculture as we sit here today, but we already see there's disparity in terms of how these regulations are going to be applied, and this is causing real global political conversations as we sit here today. One of the challenges I would have for you is that I believe these technologies, as we sit here today, gene editing, probably have more application for developing farmers in the developing world than in Europe. Why? Because, hey, we need to give people tools so the animals and the plants can work in their situation. Yet, I still believe that Africa's still watching everywhere else and saying, well, where do we go? Maybe new technologies is a chance for Africa to take leadership and say, hey, we want to deploy this. We want to be on the front foot. We want to lead and take these technologies and make a difference in the world, make a difference in people's lives. I think there's an opportunity there, and it's a bit of a challenge. But even in the most conservative markets, note the date, 5th of July. Even Europe's moving on this. Just yesterday, the Danish Minister of Agriculture said, we are missing the boat on precision breeding in Europe. This is an active conversation. And if we're not taking this conversation and having that conversation right now in Africa, again, we're going to be even further behind, because we all know that governments, no matter where they are, take time to turn those wheels so that way you can utilize these new technologies. Fundamentally, the technology is moving faster today, slower today than the science. And that's a real big risk. Because Europe's moving in terms of plans. In March this year, the UK, call Brexit whatever you want. Personally, I call it a train wreck, but that's a separate point. In the UK, Brexit does have some silver linings. By leaving Europe, they could move at a different pace. In March this year, the King signed into law the Genetic Technology Act. That took plants and animals outside of the GMO regulation. We are currently in the conversations about what does the registration process look like. Then we'll be able to deploy this technology for British pig farmers. This is real time. This is happening right now. And we can already see to the right-hand side here, a memo from January, Europe starting to think about the animal process. If we start to do risk assessments in the animal context, that's really the first cogs on the wheels of looking at a regulatory pathway in the context of Europe. Now, of course, the US continues to move with the FDA. I'm talking about Europe in the context of being the chair of FAB. Now, again, going back to that European deal, one of the other things that's high on the radar is external geopolitical factors that can affect your business. Right now, there is the biggest revision of animal welfare law in Europe that there's been in decades. And this, in my humble opinion, is going to be quite dramatic and pretty violent from what I see. This will go into law. Well, we'll see what the law looks like in about September this year. We're currently in the conversations to what it's part of. And this all falls under the umbrella of a thing I'll talk about later. Again, all of this stuff overlaps, which is the European Green Deal and specific the farm-to-fork strategy. The ultimate goal is to create higher levels of animal welfare. If you want to go in to see all of the detail, and you really want to understand, I mean, these huge documents, but there's two pieces I want to flag for this room, because I think it has implications for Africa. Yes, I really believe this animal welfare legislation could have impact on your business, on your farm. It's the welfare of pigs law and the welfare of pigs during transport law. What do these mean? And I'm not going to go into the detail, but I think it's really good to start thinking about implications. I mean, some of the implications we're talking about, and we can talk about, hey, what goes on up in crazy Europe sometimes will filter around the world. We see group housing in gestation, those sort of things. In the context of the wider management piece, certainly the removal, or at least minimizing the time that a pig is in a farrowing crate, is on the agenda. Likewise, all production in Europe moving to long-tail production. Those things are part of this conversation as we sit here. Also, interestingly, what is a complete ban on CO2 stunning during the slaughter process? I don't know what the alternative is. I'm not into the detail in that, but these things will impact how Europe produces and where they produce pork. I mean, from an African perspective, opportunity perhaps for pork producers here in the African region. In terms of the transport regulations, on the table right now is a complete and utter ban of live animal transport from any EU member state to a non-EU member state. Let's think about that for a second. That's not me taking animals from here down to like Kenya or whatever. I can't even take animals from Ireland to England. It's interesting. Or from Croatia to Bosnia. This becomes an interesting conversation because maybe you guys have got a mature genetic structure. You guys have got a mature multiplication structure. If the next wave of agricultural development in Africa really starts to take off, development of farms, investment into North Mid-Africa, if Europe's not the option for animals, suddenly South Africa looks a whole lot cheaper than going to Brazil or North America. Is there an opportunity in the future for South Africa to be that genetic hub and push and be the future of Southern African production? Interesting question, maybe an opportunity. But likewise, does it cut us off in the future from European animal imports if we want to do genetic connections? We need to understand the implications of this bill. What I'm more concerned about in the context of South Africa, in the context of Europe, in the context of the globe, is that for the first time, this animal breeding regulation starts to step into animal breeding. And the underlying piece that came out of this was large litters simply means bad welfare. For both the piglet and the sow, they say that the use of any artificial rearing, milk machines, etc., is poor welfare. And that fundamentally, number of piglets should not outnumber teats. That is the EFSA scientific opinion. And these are usually the basis for new laws. And you can see clearly in point 2, their recommendation is that we should genetically limit the number of pigs to 12 to 14. If we exceed that, we will not be approved for breeding. That line will not be approved for sale. That could lead to a complete fracture in terms of there's a breeding program for Europe, there's a breeding program for America's China. If that happens, where do you go? That's an interesting question. Now, one of the things about FAB, published last week, is it's a collective effort to try and disseminate accurate information. If you look at the author list on this paper that was published last week, PIC, Hypor, Dambred, Topigs. We pulled all of our genetic information together and said, look, we can continue to make more pigs and better at health welfare at the same time. It's not one or the other. This information was fundamentally missing in the conversation in Brussels. Is this too little, too late? We do not know, but it's an interesting point, and we continue to be very focused trying to make sure that there's some sense and some scientific rigor between what these welfare implications will mean into the future. And then sustainability. I'm looking at it from a European perspective. This is the European Green Deal. We will be carbon neutral by 2050. The US and other places are moving. Why do I talk about this? I think we're moving into a situation where there will be carbon trading. Let's look about, is this an opportunity for you? Let's not be scared about this. We create genetic improvement. We're doing more with less every generation. There's a big project happening with the National Pork Board in the United States right now, where we might be able to turn around and say, well, can we turn that genetic improvement actually in carbon credits? So you as a farmer could not only sell pigs, but sell carbon, because you're not creating it in the first place. I think that's an interesting avenue to explore into the future. But more directly, what impacts you right now is that I believe more of these metrics are going to come into the future. And when we start looking at expansion of your farms, we're going to increasingly have questions on how efficient are you from carbon perspective in terms of your access to capital as we move into the future. So stay on this. This is a moving piece. So genetics is going to change, and it's really going to be very interesting over the next 10 years. And just to wrap up, what does this mean? I think we're going to start to see very rapid improvement in terms of genetic improvement. So stay talking with those people who understand how to get that genetic potential out of the animals. Some of the production I see here today is light years away from where I was working with producers here in South Africa 10 years ago. I know that you guys can get the genetic potential out. I see it as my humble responsibility to continue delivering that genetic improvement regardless of genetic provider. But we need to be well positioned because data, technology, developing needs, I think we're all I've talked about that, and we need to understand those macro global level and the regional trends. But let's leave it with Africa. Africa will continue to develop. More people will need access to affordable animal protein, but my challenge is don't look at the situation today, because things are changing too quickly. Look down the road. And I think we're at an excellent opportunity here in Africa, not necessarily to follow the other places like we've done in the past. But my challenge to everybody in this room is let's be proactive, and there's an opportunity to lead the way in terms of new technologies and driving the future of agricultural production. Thanks. Appreciate it.